Welcome everyone to the Buddhist path of awakening. And let's bow in. Tonight, we will continue working our way through, or enjoying our way through the book, The Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma by Chogyam Trungpa, on Volume 1, getting to the end of Volume 1. And we have been covering the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, the origin of suffering, that there is a cessation to suffering, and finally tonight, the path leading to the cessation of suffering. If you are just joining us and want to continue, you'll find information about this course at the website for the Buddhist Path of Awakening and the book that we're working through, and you can get a copy and join us. So welcome if you're here for the first time. And tonight we're going to lead off with Michael Kern. So Michael, take it away.
Okay, so as John just said, tonight we'll be talking about the Fourth Noble Truth, the truth of the path. And the first thing that Trungpa Rinpoche tells us is that the nature of the path is up to you. It's your doing in a sense, but there are guidelines. A do-it-yourself kit is presented to you by your teacher. You're given all the necessary equipment and all the necessary attitudes. Then you're sent off to the jungle and you have to live by means of your survival kit. So that's where we start. Now, in terms of equipment, I guess we could think of first and foremost our meditation practice, which is necessary in order to travel on the path. And then we have the teachings themselves. But what's important in regard to the teachings themselves is that we need to make them personal. We need to come to understand what they mean to us in terms of our actual experience. At his death, or parinirvana, in a very similar light, the Buddha said, be a lamp unto yourself. So ultimately, that's what the path is about. We need to be a lamp unto ourselves. In order to do that, we need to approach the teachings, not just in a conceptual sense so that we have some understanding, although that's important, but we really have to make the teachings personal. We really need to look at, what does it mean to me? How do I experience this? The other thing about this Trungpa Rinpoche's comment that we're sent off to the jungle is it emphasizes the non-theistic nature of the Buddhist path, that no one else is going to save you. The Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha are there as support and encouragement, but ultimately it comes down to each one of us, me, you, each one of us. And again, we're just in the beginning sent off to the jungle. So I thought as part of understanding the path, it might be helpful just to review the first three noble truths a little bit so that we understand why it's important, or some of what's important in terms of making this kind of personal connection, or a sense of under some understanding in our actual experience, what these different teachings mean. So the first noble truth was the truth of suffering. And I think what's important here is to understand that overall, the point of the Hinayana path, the foundational vehicle, is individual liberation. And it would be really difficult to achieve individual liberation if we didn't know we're imprisoned or trapped to begin with. And this is why some understanding of suffering and the truth of suffering and the pervasiveness of suffering becomes important. For myself, every time I contemplate the first noble truth, it shakes me up a little bit every time. Even if everything's going well and I'm not dealing with any kind of major stressor in my life, old age may be irritating at times, but it seems workable. And as far as I know, I don't have a major illness, and death doesn't seem to be around the corner for me. But I realized that there's no certainty about any of that. And even if everything's going well, that there's still that nature of all pervasive suffering that Trungpa Rinpoche talks about, that edge of anxiety and paranoia that we need, having to hold it together, and the fear of things falling apart. And that this is the clue, this is the wake-up call to come to realize that that we're dreaming, that we're asleep, and that the things that we think are going to work for us, our search for happiness in the external world, our attempts to create a world for ourselves that is secure and comfortable, that this actually creates suffering, that the best we can do is create situations that are in the end impermanent, that fall apart. And then we have to deal with the pain of alternation, losing what we had, getting what we don't want, and so on. So as it turns out, the truth of suffering really provides a wake-up call. It's, I think, the red pill in the Matrix. Maybe I got my colors mixed up. But in any case, it's a wake-up call. And that we come to realize there's actually a certain intelligence in suffering. But we have to recognize this possibility of waking up, because from the point of view of ego, from the point of view of believing in a self, the relationship that ego has to suffering is to react in different ways: resentment, jealousy, anger, ignorance, numbing out, lashing out. And all of those things actually make it worse. So if we don't recognize the wake-up call that suffering provides, we just create further suffering. We actually make it worse. We know in our lives, we've seen in our lives that aggression begets aggression. And we come to realize that we just act in ways that actually perpetuate suffering. So we come to the second noble truth, or we will if I turn to the right page. I'm either over-prepared or under-prepared today, and I'm not sure which. In any case, the second noble truth, that we need to see in ourselves, in our lives, how the origin of suffering works. And if you remember back to the reading we did, Trungpa Rinpoche talked about that the origin of suffering comes from absent-mindedness, not being aware. And that furthermore, it's based on the belief of an eternity. And from that comes the hope of maintaining oneself, continuing to be. So it's this belief in ego, the belief in some type of permanent self as independent and permanent. We need to understand how that works, how that manifests in our lives in a moment-to-moment way. And also he talked about the nature of the kleshas as suffering, passion, aggression, and ignorance, that once we believe in a self, once we have this idea that we exist in some set, fixed way, then we start looking at the world around us and finding objects and things that we find attractive. We start feeling like we need to protect what we have, so we become aggressive toward the things that we see as threats. And we ignore the rest, and that this fuels the kleshas. This is where he talked about the power of flickering thoughts and how our internal dialogue, our constant chatter in our mind, where we look at things and evaluate things and ponder things, how these flickering thoughts provide a pilot light for the kleshas that just flare up and take us over. If we don't understand the nature of ego and how ego works, then our attempts to follow a spiritual path will be compromised. We'll end up just with ego trying to make a better ego. We'll get caught up in ego self-deception. We'll be caught up in trying to secure ourselves, perhaps not in conventional way, but through meditation practice or something else, so that rather than freeing us, rather than liberating us, we'll fall into the trap of spiritual materialism, trying to create some kind of world for ourselves that feels secure, that feels comfortable, that feels predictable. And with the kleshas, passion, aggression, and ignorance, here the problem is that we tend to identify with the kleshas. We actually think they're us, at least in the moment when we're caught up in them. I listened to a talk once by Punlap Rinpoche where somebody asked him about why we're so attached to the kleshas. And he gave an answer that was kind of interesting and kind of funny. But he said he thought we had a Stockholm syndrome relationship with the kleshas. We've been with them so long, we think they work, and we identify with them. We think that being aggressive or grasping passion, that we think these things work for us, and we identify with them instead of realizing that they're not truly who we are, but they're what result from the dream of ego. They're what results from that initial moment of absent-mindedness, of not being aware, that then we solidify into a thought of I exist. And from there, we develop all these strategies of passion, aggression, and ignorance. But again, the important thing is to see this moment to moment in our lives. It's helpful, again, to have a general conceptual sense of the kleshas and a general conceptual sense of the skandhas, how the initial identification of self with some type of form, and then elaboration into feeling and so on, all the way through consciousness. It's helpful to understand that conceptually, but what's really important is applying that to how we actually live our lives and what we actually see in our personal experience. So then we come to the third noble truth with the awareness of suffering and with the awareness of the origin of suffering. We have some idea of what it is that we're trying to let go of. But with cessation, we find that it's that cessation, as Trungpa Rinpoche says, is not just an idea, but it's something we can experience, something we can glimpse. And it's important as well to recognize these glimpses. Otherwise, simply saying there's a cessation to suffering doesn't do us much good. We actually have to realize, and in this regard in particular, meditation practice is vital, that we have these glimpses. As Trungpa Rinpoche says, we should get rid of the fictitious stories about how great it is to get there, to cessation. The question is whether we have to use our imagination or whether we actually can experience a sense of relief or freedom. Imagination does not play a very important role. It doesn't help us at all in getting results. And in the chapter on, sorry, I need to get my book up here. In the chapter on cessation, the very first thing he says is the third noble truth is based on recognizing the contrast between samsara and nirvana. In the technique of meditating on the breath, there's automatically and naturally such a contrast. You realize that something is alternating in you, that your sanity and your insanity are alternating. You experience a gap. Relating to that gap is relating to the contrast between samsara and nirvana. So again, it's important to recognize, important to realize that we have these little moments, at least, of cessation. We can at least glimpse the possibility. It's very helpful, I think, to have these descriptions of things that we might experience or come to recognize through our meditation practice, or that we might begin to recognize as a result of meditation practice, for at least two reasons. One is that it's encouragement. It helps us to realize that something is happening, and it gives us the motivation to move onward. Sometimes I feel with things that I've read that it's not unlike when I'm hiking in the woods and start worrying about getting lost, and then I see a trail mark and I realize, no, I'm not lost. I'm still on the path. So it's helpful to read these descriptions, and such as the recognizing of the gap, or even later in the chapter where on cessation, where he begins talking about Xinjiang, developing flexibility, workability of mind, and coming to realize on our experience that these things actually do happen. But at the same time, it's really important that we don't try to create these experiences. As he says later in the chapter, it has to occur naturally or organically. As he says later, if we try to create or fabricate experiences, this becomes a problem. Achievement comes naturally. If you're constantly trying to achieve cessation, it's a problem. You will not achieve it that way. Whenever you take an ego-oriented approach, you become allergic to yourself. So again, it's important to see all these things in our practice. It's important to, and in our experience, and it's important to make this kind of real personal connection to the teachings. I think this is one of the things he means when he said in the beginning that you're given all the necessary equipment and all the necessary attitudes. So in the chapter that on the path that we read for tonight, the doubtless path. For a minute, I doubted whether I remembered the title right, but it's the doubtless path. He says that there are four sequential processes that developed, and that these are impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and egolessness as a sequential process, and that these could be viewed as problems or promises. But basically, when you're traveling on the path, you need to know what to expect and what to overcome. So with impermanence, the first thing to overcome is the notion of eternity. He says the wisdom of impermanence applies to whatever is subject to becoming, to happening, or to being gathered together. Our relationship with impermanence from the point of view of ego is a mixed one. We're happy when bad experiences come to an end, but we experience suffering when good experience is coming to the end. But in either case, the real problem is what he calls eternalism, taking things to be real and permanent. And I think in understanding that, again, what's really important is looking at our moment-to-moment experience in meditation. I think in a general way, we recognize impermanence. We see the seasons change, we see the weather change, we see ourselves change, we see the people around us change. But what he's talking about, taking something real as something is real, is something that happens right in the moment. And as we slow down and settle in meditation practice, we might begin to see this. We might begin to see this even if it's only in taking our thoughts as real and then becoming distracted by them and then coming back. Or it could be something in our daily experience where we're feeling fairly good driving somewhere, and then something happens in front of us, and suddenly we're really angry at another person and have a very solid idea about the idiot that just cut us off, or whatever it is. So the point is, eternalism happens in the moment. It's not that we have particular fixed belief over a long period of time. It's how we take things as real in the moment. And we come to see this in meditation practice. We see how we take thoughts to be real so that we engage in them and wander in distraction. The second in the sequence is the suffering. And here he says the second thing that needs to be overcome is our constant search for pleasure. This is what leads us into spiritual materialism. This is what leads us into looking for some kind of satisfaction, some sort of permanent happiness in the world around us, rather than looking inward and actually coming to understand ourselves and understanding our mind. So that we have to recognize that this incessant search for pleasure results in suffering. It's not to mean that there aren't some things that might bring relative pleasure, but because we tend to get attached, I think it was Talopa said to Naropa, the problem isn't in appearances, the problem is in our attachments. The third thing that he talks about is emptiness. And this was interesting to me because emptiness is really more associated with the Mahayana teachings. But then again, Trungpa Rinpoche taught the Hinayana in light of the Mahayana and Vajrayana. But basically, he talks here about a gap of nothingness, non-existence, which is desolation even, but it's the ultimate letting go. And as he says, both things that exist outside you and the things that exist inside you are subject to impermanence and suffering. And for that reason, begin to let go. So emptiness is a vast topic in the Mahayana, but the basic idea here again is how, if we go back to the first thing, impermanence, how we take things to be real, how much of what we take to be real and solid is really a projection of mind. It's an imputation of mind. And we experience this in various ways in our lives all the time. We just don't fully recognize the implications of it. But for instance, it was interesting to me the first time that I did foreign travel, how I felt about the money I had in my pocket. So if you go, maybe not to Canada, but if you go to Europe or an Asian country, dollar bills, most people have no interest in. You might as well be handing them a blank piece of paper. But if you have the local currency, it has great value to you and everyone else. And then you come back to the United States, and if you haven't exchanged the foreign currency, suddenly nobody here is interested in your foreign money either, unless they're, something about the oddity. So our projection of value and the reality of money is really subjective and really dependent on conditions. And that's one of the ways in which we might at least begin to have some sense of what emptiness is and what the kind of desolation that he talks about is. But basically, if we understand emptiness and impermanence, it becomes much easier to let go, to understand something about non-attachment. And then the last of the four that he talks about is egolessness. So this is the last in the sequence of the path. And here, having realized emptiness, you begin to realize there's no one to hang on to the realization or to celebrate that experience. So you encounter egolessness. And he talks about ego as this constantly referring to the nature of self that we always feel, the sense of a center. And that the problem with centering is that you're coming back to your individual being as opposed to a selfless center. So that everything refers back to I, me, and mine. And this becomes suffering. And if we don't recognize the empty nature of self, the fact that at least at a minimum, come to recognize how the nature of self changes from moment to moment. One minute we're angry, the next minute we're something else. We wake up in the morning with all kinds of motivations that we forget about an hour later. If we don't have some sense of the emptiness of self, we become very fixated and we become that much more attached to the strategies, passion, aggression, and ignorance that arise out of the belief in a self. So of these four, impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and egolessness, impermanence, suffering, and egolessness are traditionally referred to as the three marks of existence. And by marks of existence, what that seems to mean is literally the expression or the essence of what existence is. As Trungpa Rinpoche said when he talked about the marks of existence, he said, for instance, the mark of fire is heat. So impermanence, egolessness, and suffering characterize every moment of conditioned existence. He also talked about the four qualities of path in this chapter. He said the nature of the path, again, is more like an expedition or an exploration than following a road that has been built. You have to make your own way. So again, we're back to working with our practice and working with our study to awaken our own intelligence. We're back to, again, having to come to understand what the teachings mean to each one of us personally. We have to make our own discoveries. And in this sense, he talked about, he says that the path is designed to clear out and develop, to clear out obstacles and develop particular patterns or qualities. And he notes that it's hard work. This is something we actually have to work with. And he says, first of all, he talked about the four qualities of path. And the first quality is searching for the real meaning of suchness or the real meaning of Dharma. And this is something that, again, we really need to look at our actual in the moment experience in meditation to have some understanding of. In meditation, it's just what it is to be with our experience fully, without looking to change anything, without looking for anything further, simply resting in the present moment so that we see things as they actually are, rather than seeing things the way that we might fear that they are or the way that we might hope that they are, just things as they actually are. He even says in this that this is getting a bit beyond Hinayana. He says it's a bit in the Zeni or in the Zen tradition. Second thing he talks about is quality of path is insight. And in particular here, we're talking about the importance again of sitting meditation practice. The sitting practice of meditation is based on shamatha discipline, which provides immense clarity and the ability to relate with situations very fully, precisely, and completely. Any neurosis that comes up becomes extremely visible and clear. And each time a certain neurosis arises appropriate to that time, the neurosis itself becomes a spokesperson to develop further clarity. So a neurosis serves two purposes, showing the path and showing its own suicidal quality. That is what's known as insight, knowing the nature of dharmas as they are. So here we're really talking about working with mindfulness awareness, settling the mind, and then letting mind's natural clarity develop so that we begin to see things very clearly. As John said last week, all of the readings in this book, the Profound Treasury, come from the seminary. The one aspect of seminary experience that is not included in the book are the questions and answers that come up. And I wanted to read just a section of question and answer from my seminary, actually, 1982, because there's some questions in here about the Four Noble Truths. So the questioner asked Trungpa Rinpoche, the sutra says that the Buddha is free from extreme torment. I think tonight you said that he is free from torment of any kind. In one of our classes, we were talking about the third noble truth, the idea of the cessation of suffering. We were wondering whether that's cessation of all types of suffering or only some types of suffering. Which type of pain and suffering does the sutra refer to? And Trungpa Rinpoche says, well, the notion of torment is slightly open to interpretation, but the idea is that once you attain some basic understanding of shamatha vipassana experience, you are free from tormenting yourself. This is because you have attained mindfulness already. Questioner, referring to basic anxiety, this is the all-pervasive suffering. The analogy used was that for someone who didn't have any experience of shamatha vipassana, pain might be like a hair on their finger, whereas someone who was more realized would feel the pain like a hair in the eye. That seems to imply that there is the possibility of actually intensifying suffering. Trungpa Rinpoche, no, not quite intensifying. If you have a hair on your hand, it's uncertain. You haven't necessarily seen it. But if you have a hair in your eye, it is much more acute and direct. At the same time, it is very clearly perceived. The point is that good shamatha vipassana discipline results in your experiencing subtleties, further subtleties of things. Therefore, you experience more direct and acute pain as well. But you also have experienced that acute pain is workable because you are able to single out individual things rather than just generally being in pain and being pissed off at the rest of the world. So there is one particular thing happening at a time. See what I mean? Questioner, yes, sir. Trungpa Rinpoche, like having a hair in your eye. Questioner, would the Buddha experience Mahadukkha? Mahadukkha would be great suffering. Trungpa Rinpoche, he could for the moment, but then he does not dwell on it. Therefore, he is free from it. Questioner, dwelling is where the torment comes in? Trungpa Rinpoche, yes, yes. Questioner, thank you very much. So I read that because I think it really gets at what we experience through clarity of meditation practice, and also the importance of coming to understand what it means not to be so attached to our thinking process and not being so caught up in wandering. The third quality of the path is associating with basic sanity. And here he says again, practice enables us to relate with the misconceptions of the Dharma, such as eternalism and nihilism. And again, that we're not trying to create any particular state of mind in practice, but we're just learning to just be with our experience. As he says, in contrast, in the sitting practice of meditation, you are becoming like a rock, like an ocean. You do not have to go through any list. You just are the way you are, just being. Through meditation practice, you're associating yourself with basic sanity, which takes place continuously. So practice plays a very important part. And then the final quality of the path is permanent nirvana. And here basically he talks about coming to know the tricks of neurosis, the tricks of our mind, which goes all the way back to understanding the origin of suffering in particular, so that we understand something about the workings of ego and spiritual materialism. And also that with the fruition of the path, that we finally have a direction, and that we, through the clarity that we begin to experience in meditation practice, we have a doubtless sense of where it is that we're trying to go. So I think I'll stop there. It's more than enough, but thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So I'll pick up where Michael left off with the second chapter, which is on the 5 paths. This is a structure which developed in Indian Buddhism and was taken into Tibet. You can find it explicated in a number of places. The great teacher Atisha, who went to Tibet in the 11th century, discussed it in one of his works, and Gampopa, the original founder of our sect, the Kagyu sect of Tibetan Buddhism, also discusses it in his famous work, The Jewel Ornament of Liberation. The 5 paths, I'm going to give you a quick overview of them before we go into them in a little more detail. And what they are is a delineation of the path as a whole into 5 stages. The first stage is the path of accumulation, it's called. And this is Tsoglam, right, the path of accumulation. Lam means path in Tibetan, Tsog in this case means accumulating. And what this means is that you are entering the path and you are being helped by a teacher or teachers, and you are becoming familiar with the teachings as they are presented in various writings, and you are becoming convinced of the truth of these teachings and inspired by them. And that leads into the second path, which is called the path of unification. Jorlam, Lam means path, Jor means unification. And really what happens is that having discovered these teachings and these practices and become convinced that they apply to you and that they work with you and that they explain your unhappiness, your suffering, that they give you a credible description of a way out of that, then you actually begin to practice them. You begin to practice meditation, you begin to study these teachings and develop a view and a greater intellectual understanding of your situation. And this is the second path, the path of unification. They say at this level of the path, you are developing what in Sanskrit is called a kusala chitta. It means a healthy mind. That is, you're beginning to switch your mind from the self-aggrandizement of ego, which is what we had when we came to the path, to a beginning to appreciate oneself and one's world as they are arising in the present moment. And that quality of appreciation and openness and presence is healthy. And that's why they call this second path, the path of unification, developing a healthy mind, a kusala, healthy chitta mind. This is the preparation for the third stage of the path, which is called the path of seeing. And at this point, the practitioner, having been introduced to the teachings, having developed a relationship with a teacher, having practiced and begun to appreciate the sanity and the wisdom of the teachings, as well as the insanity and the ignorance of ego mind, then begins at the third stage of the third path, rather, to actually see reality. This happens in a glimpse initially, and it usually happens in relationship with a teacher, that a teacher is a person who embodies this and understands this vision of reality very well and can communicate it to the student. And so the student, usually in relationship to the teacher, although people often have it just by themselves, experiences a glimpse of reality itself. And this really is getting into the Mahayana, the second division of the path altogether. You know, we were talking about the Hinayana, the lesser vehicle, and we're going to be moving into the second volume of these 3 volumes of Trungpa Rinpoche's works, which is all about the Mahayana. And the Mahayana has as its foundation this glimpse, this understanding of reality. And reality here is called emptiness, shunyata. And it's because the student has had an experience of this and an understanding of this, which they can again have in over and over again through practice, that now they are beginning to proceed really and with traction, you might say, on the path. The third path is just this momentary experience. The fourth path, which is called the path of meditation, what that merely fundamentally means is that having glimpsed the real in one degree or another, then one takes that as one's meditation. Meditation ceases to be simply a mental exercise of focusing one's mind on one thing or another, and instead becomes a return again and again to that vision of the real that the student had in the third path. And so the path of meditation now, instead of being a way of training or training the mind to like developing a muscle, it becomes a remembering, a return, a recreating of that insight into the nature of reality over and over and over again. And this really, you see, the third path with that glimpse of reality is the entrance into the Mahayana. The Mahayana is divided into 10 stages. They're called bhumis. Bhumi literally means earth, but in this context, it means stage or coming down to earth. And it's divided into these 10. The first bhumi is that experience of the third path, the opening to emptiness, to shunyata, the discovery of this, which is the absence, fundamentally, it's the absence of ego and of other. It's beginning to realize that the ideas that we carried around of I and other, this constant relational problem, was a mistake. It was a myth. It was a creation of a fiction, and it doesn't really happen. It was a lie, to put it in terms of Rinpoche's words at one point. And we realizing that is the entrance into the Mahayana, the first bhumi, which is actually called, the name of the first bhumi, the first stage, is great joy. Great joy, why? Because one has discovered what reality really is. The second through the 10th bhumis are the stages of the path that are experienced and discovered in the fourth path, the path of meditation. Again, the fourth path of meditation is constantly returning to that experience that one had in the third path, which is the experience of emptiness, of shunyata, of reality, and deepening it. The first reaction is that a practitioner might have when experiencing emptiness is, oh, I had an experience of emptiness. And you can hear what's wrong with that. It's the I has reasserted itself, ego, and is now co-opting emptiness, which is the absence of ego. And that is the problem that one is overcoming in the fourth path, the path of meditation, over and over and over again, as one proceeds through these bhumis, that sense of I, the experiencer, the traveler, the one who is experiencing egolessness. You can hear the quandary in that remark, right? The contradiction is it becomes thinner and thinner. That sense of I is being worn out through these second, third, fourth, up to the 10th bhumi. And that is the path of meditation. One experiences and practices the path of meditation by coming back to reality over and over again. And we do this all the time in our meditation practice, even from the beginning, when we're just rank beginners. Because what we do is we get lost in thought, and we're lost in some klesha. Klesha means defilement. It means emotional problem, like anger or lust or jealousy or whatever it might be. There are many kleshas. There are 5 or 6 fundamental ones, but there are actually subtle hundreds of them. And one gets caught in a klesha, and the klesha always involves two aspects: the story that we tell and the energy that informs that story. And we get lost in this energetic story of, let's say, jealousy. Oh, I'm jealous of that person. They have what I want. I'm a good person too. I should have that. And we tell ourselves this story, and we feel the anger and the angst and the jealous emotion of it. And then suddenly something wakes us up. It could be anything. So it's various. And we come back, we say, oh, I was caught in a dream. That is the process of the fourth path. We are constantly waking up. We are experiencing the dream, and then we suddenly realize, oh, I'm dreaming. And at the instant that you realize that you're dreaming, you're back. This is something we can do throughout our days. We walk down the street. We're heading towards, Starbucks, where there's a Starbucks on every corner in Manhattan. And you're heading towards Starbucks, but you're lost in thought. And you walk right by. And then suddenly something happens. A horn goes off in the street. You stumble on something on the sidewalk, and you realize, oh, I've been dreaming, and I walked right past the store. And you go back because you have awoken. You have come back to reality, to this present time and place. And that is the practice of the 10 bhumis, constantly coming back, but now we're coming back to what we experienced in the third path, which is the vision of emptiness. And we come back again and again, and we get lost again and again, and then we realize we're lost, and we come back. This is the bird song of the path. Come back. Come back to what? Come back to this time and place, here and now, which is the real. We come back from the dream. And the more we do that, we progress through these 10 stages, and ego, that sense of the watcher, of the judge, the evaluator, the self-aggrandizer, gets thinner and thinner and more subtle. And reality, which is this present moment in all of its qualities, which are primarily those 4 marks of existence that Michael just went through, which are impermanence, suffering, egolessness, and emptiness. That comes back again and again. We come back to that real world, and it's vivid, it's beautiful, it's utterly impermanent and transient, instant by instant. And we progress through the fourth path, the path of meditation, until finally we wear out ego, that self-aggrandizer, that sense of me and other, and how I'm going to co-opt and use other for my benefit. We wear that out. And at the end of the Mahayana path, end of the 10 bhumis, the final result is enlightenment itself, which is the utter cutting through of belief in I and other, the complete entrance into shunyata without any kind of self-aggrandizement. And also the arising now of the whole Vajrayana path, which is the path of enlightenment itself, and which is full of the beauty and the vividness of this phenomenal world as it arises and is revealed in the present moment. So that is a quick overview of these 5 paths. I think that if you understand that the first path is the path of being introduced to the teachings, and he talks about it, let's see what he says. Path of accumulation. is based on getting acquainted with the teachings and the teacher. Now, the teacher means the principle of the teacher. It might not be an individual. It can mean the Sangha can be your teacher. It's the principle of how the teachings are transmitted through one or more people. And it's a lot of hard work to learn the teachings, a lay person's beginner level. You're getting acquainted with these teachings what these teachings are all about is becoming more and more sane, giving up the constant I-other battle. Another teacher, Michael was talking about the purpose of the kleshas. Another teacher I've heard says that the purpose of the kleshas, that means these defiling emotions, hatred, anger, jealousy, lust, desire, pride, whatever it might be, that their purpose is to give ego, I, an occupation, to prove that I exist. And then when you begin to cut through these kleshas, these defilements, I loses its function. And it's proof that I am there. So in this first path of accumulation, you're learning that the Dharma has to do with sanity, the issues of clarity and confusion, and that it's more psychologically oriented than behavior pattern oriented. So the idea of being a good person, like being kind to others, which is a nice thing, or experiencing happy mental states, becomes completely secondary, all of that. Because what the path is really about is understanding the fundamental problem of confusion, of ignorance, on the one hand, and its obverse, the alternative to that, which is sanity and clarity and enlightenment on the other. He says about the first path, by not buying our own habitual thought patterns, that means, being seduced by them, we begin to develop discipline and mindfulness. And the way this begins to happen is that we begin to see the transparency and the arbitrariness and the untruthfulness of our thoughts. We begin to realize that thoughts are just relative truth. They are true perhaps at a particular time and place, but again and again, as we repeat them over and over again, they just become birdsong. And we begin to realize this, and in contrast, we begin to see that our experience as it arises in the present moment is really true. This is the absolute truth. And we begin to see and appreciate this contrast between what our thoughts are saying about our experience on the one hand, which is very partial and often very untrue, and the experience itself as it arises and is ultimately true on the other hand. So we're beginning to experience relative and ultimate truth. All of this is happening at the level of the path of accumulation. The path of unification, he says, your actions and your psychological state are beginning to work together, and you begin to develop glimpses of sanity, real sanity. And it has 5 categories. And we can go through these, but I think let me see what the time is like here. No, we're getting kind of late. But they are faith, exertion, recollection, one-pointedness, and intellect. And faith means that we realize what we need to avoid, which is fundamentally subconscious gossip, which happens all the time, and grasping, and what should be cultivated, which is steadiness of mind, clarity in this present moment. And the exertion of this path means appreciation, that we appreciate that our shamatha practice and our vipassana practice are bringing us into this clarity of mind. And so we are inspired to practice them. The third one is recollection, trenpa, which is not memory, but is really an intelligence of being able to know what is happening and follow it. That you are aware of what you have done, experiencing what you have done, and where you are and what you are. And there's genuine respect and appreciation for what you've received and what you're doing. Then the Fourth quality is one-pointedness, tingzen. Tingzen usually means samadhi, translated into the Sanskrit samadhi. And it just means that from time to time, we actually come back and here we are, solidly aware. That is samadhi. When we are solidly aware of this present moment, this time and place. And the last quality is intellect, which is prajna, sharab, which has many meanings, and we're at a very early stage of it. And here what it means is that we can separate what should be cultivated and what needs to be avoided. The third path, I'm going to jump to that, is the path of seeing. And he goes through the 7 limbs of enlightenment, and which are very similar to what we've already discussed. These are different qualities that develop because we're now beginning to see reality, and that we don't forget this path, that's recollection, and that we are realizing through this experience of reality, we're beginning to realize isness, ta-ta-ta, suchness, which is another name for reality, and that we begin to develop exertion, which is that we never give up, and we have a positive ambition, a forward vision, and that there's joy in this. The joy comes from realizing, on the one hand, that we don't have to strive. In fact, striving is anti-dharma. It is feeling that there's something wrong with us that we have to correct, and that we can give that up. And that produces great joy. We learn that we can relax, and that we're already, by relaxing and doing nothing, we're coming back into this reality and proceeding along the path. And in the same vein, we become thoroughly shinjant. That means that we're calmed down and we're pacified and purified. Our neurosis is beginning to really settle and become clear on this third path. And we experience absorption again, tingzen, samadhi, and that is absorption in the real, and equilibrium, because as we begin to see this at the level of this first bhumi, this path of seeing the real, we develop enormous equilibrium, steadiness, peace. The fourth path, the path of meditation, he goes through the Noble Eightfold Path here. And I don't think I'm going to do this because we are getting late, and it's in the readings. And finally, he talks about the path of no more learning, which is the fifth path. And this is where enlightenment itself takes place. And he says here, the teachings exist in order for you to get better, in order for you to develop. That's a known fact. And yet, and what he's talking about here is there's a fundamental conundrum. And that is that we have to, as we proceed along the path, we are hoping to become enlightened. We see this enlightenment as a goal. And yet the very nature of the path is to give up goal orientation, is to give up this idea of self-aggrandizement, like I am going to get enlightened. And this is the fundamental conundrum and the fundamental thing that we are working with as we proceed along the path. And it's really the essence of the path of no more learning, that we realize that we don't have to constantly try to improve ourselves, that in fact, we have Buddha nature, and that we can, having discovered that, we can begin to relax into it. He says, as you progress along the path, you're in a constant process of becoming more and more intelligent. And by intelligent, he means that we're giving up this search for something that's going to make us better. You don't particularly expect happiness out of the path. However, you do expect sophistication and the relief of confidence that something is actually happening. You don't have to know where you are on the path, but you need to know that you are moving and that you are going to get to your destination. However, if you're too concerned with getting from here to there as fast as possible, you find yourself in a lot of pain. It is not how fast you can get there, but the movement that matters. So as we go along, we begin to develop more and more the faith, the confidence that our practice and our study is actually bringing us along the path. And the more we develop that faith and confidence, the more we can relax. And just we begin to become observers of our own progress. He says, your fundamental ignorance is the cause of all karmic coincidence. Karma is really the process by which we suffer. But instead of stupidly going along with that, you begin to wake up by means of meditation practice. The meditation is coming back to this time, this place, and beginning to understand more and more its true nature, which is shunyata. You are aware of trying to cut through twofold ego fixation. That means shunyata. You're more and more of shunyata. Shunyata is the cutting through of the twofold ego fixation. That is belief in I and correspondingly belief in other. They two go together. That out there proves that I'm here as the observer. And I here as the observer am looking at that out there. And that is the twofold ego fixation. Cutting through that and beginning to experience the absence of I and other, which is a kind of vividness, a beauty in this world, a fluidity in the present moment, is the waking up that he's referring to. He says you are aware of trying to cut through the twofold ego fixation, and you are beginning to knock the guts out of the whole thing. You are putting lots of effort and energy into that. It is very straightforward, and that's what our practice is about. And here is the last thing he says in this chapter. Practice is fundamental. It is a genuine cure. And it happens in spite of ourselves. We practice and we think, am I getting somewhere with this? Oh yeah, I got somewhere with this. That's all ego. But the practice itself is wearing ego out. And that's what it's doing, as long as we continue it. It has been said that Dharma is the medicine, the teacher is a physician, and you are the patient. If you have a sickness that medicine can cure, the teacher can diagnose you and treat it. And as you go on through the yanas, the stages of the path, from the Hinayana to the Vajrayana, that cure becomes much tougher and more accurate. That is the notion of Sadharma. Sadharma means true Dharma. Sadharma is the ultimate cure because it deals not only with the symptoms, but also with the sickness itself. So I'll stop there and we could have a discussion. I think if you remember that the first path is path of accumulation, is getting familiar with and the teachings and becoming inspired and meeting a teacher. The second path is beginning to work on yourself and beginning to come present and beginning to develop a clearer mind and more understanding, a healthy mind. A healthy mind is a mind that appreciates this world more and more. And that the third path is the true path of vision, is a sudden awakening that one can experience. And the fourth path is the cultivation of that. And then the fifth path is enlightenment itself. So,
I got a question, John.
okay, Fred.
What is it about the nature of suffering that brings us to this fourth path, or like the fourth stage of the the Four Noble Truths, the path, because like my experience with suffering is if I'm feeling all right, suffering is not too bad. Practicing sometimes could be tricky, like I trick myself out of it. But then if it's like the suffering's heavy, it's like the path just becomes more apparent, and it's like I don't know what is it about it in the nature of it.
I don't know, Michael, you could help with this too. I think that as one begins to understand, you see, he starts this fourth chapter by saying that, this last chapter, by saying the first noble truth is the ground on which the fourth is founded. That is, the realization of suffering brings an understanding and discovery of the path. So when you begin to understand how suffering works, then you begin to understand what you need to do to fundamentally solve that problem. And as long as you're just trying to overcome suffering, like if you're hungry, you're going to eat something, like, if somebody hurts you, you're going to punch them in the nose, whatever it might be. As long as you're just trying to attack suffering in that way, it's self-perpetuating. It goes on and on and on. But these teachings that begin with the first path, the path of accumulation, show us that the nature of suffering comes from a mistake, a belief in I and other, and that it's self-perpetuating. And then we begin, and that the practice of meditation is beginning to step out of that constant, cyclical, circular, self-perpetuating game, and coming back to the real, to waking up. That's my take. Michael, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that says it fairly well. The idea, I think, is that without some recognition of suffering, we just stay caught up in ego's game. We think that from the point of view of ego, which believes in its own existence, then it only makes sense to try to accumulate the things you want, push away the things you don't want. And it's only when we realize that that doesn't work that we stop looking outward for some kind of happiness, some kind of security, some kind of perfection, and start looking inward, the thing that we can really start making a change. But as long as, that's what people conventionally do. If ego strategy worked, then we should all be blissfully happy all the time. And the point is that it doesn't. And so it's those moments of disappointment that kind of allow us to see a gap in the ego's game, you could say.
Okay.
Thank you.
I remember that Christy had her hand up.
Thanks, Fred, for that question. I think I'm like right there with you. My question was just about, I think it just goes along just right with what we're talking about. Under insight, through clarity, transcending neurosis, that was kind of what, at the end of that paragraph, it says, so neurosis serves two purposes: showing the path and showing its own suicidal quality. And so I guess my question was going to be, is neurosis, like, how does neurosis, I guess, show us the path? And I think that I just put it together, just hearing you guys talking about that. Maybe it's just that the strength of neurosis, like sometimes neurosis like shows itself to us like a hurricane or like a tsunami. And maybe, that's kind of, I know for me, what, when I'm really suffering and I have like these really strong bouts of neurosis, that's what shakes me into sort of sanity, I think. So I guess I'm just trying to understand this for myself. But the issue of suicidal quality, I think that's really interesting, because I'm seeing that these hurricanes, like these things that come up for me, do have a shelf life. Like they do ultimately destroy themselves, So I don't know. I think that was just, I just really appreciated that last exchange, because I think I'm starting to understand how that's working with me as well.
Let me address
Yeah, anything to add?
neurosis' suicidal quality, that issue. We want to get rid of pain. And the pain lies, and there is pain in life, right? I mean, getting old is painful. Getting stabbed in the leg is painful. Being ill, there are real pains in life. And we'd like to get rid of pain. And we'd like to get rid of our psychological pain too, which has to do with feeling dissatisfied with the way things are, which is ego's birdsong. Ego is constantly saying, I don't like the way things are, I want to make them better. And ultimately, ego can come to the point where it says, I can't get rid of this suffering. So the only thing I can do to get rid of it is to kill myself. And it becomes suicidal. And there are people who do this, who kill themselves, obviously. The problem is that ego is the actor. And as Trungpa Rinpoche once said, ego wants to be there at its own funeral. And it will be at its own funeral, because consciousness and the ego continues. When you kill the body, commit suicide, you just killed the body. But the sense of I in the mind, this is what the Buddhist teachings tell us, continues. And so when a person commits suicide, at some point, they wake up to realize that they've killed their body, but that the I that they were trying to kill is still there. That constant return to I. And so that suicide is fundamentally impossible. You can't do it. The only way to really commit suicide is to get enlightened. Because when you do that, then what you're realizing is that ego was just a story. In fact, worse than a story, it was a lie. The lie that I am. And that I am needs to be constantly reinforced and cultivated. I mean, suicide is the literal act of suicide is so tragic, because people are changing the situation. They think that they're going to get release from this suffering. But the one who is committing the suicide is the sufferer, and it still exists, goes on. I remember, I've told this story many times, but it had such a profound effect on me, that in the very early days when Trungpa Rinpoche first arrived, one of his students committed suicide, Tom O'Leary. And the parents came and took the body. And a few days later, we had a ceremony, which took place in a field out in North Boulder, an empty field, in the middle of winter, gray sky, cold. Somebody lit a fire in an oil drum for warmth. And there were maybe 20, 30, 40 of us, I don't know, standing around. Rinpoche's first words were, just about now, Tom is discovering that he hasn't gotten out of anything. He was a good friend. So the suicidal quality of ego is because we want to try and get rid of our suffering, but that isn't the way. The only way to overcome suffering, the first noble truth, is by treading the path, by practicing meditation, study, and realizing ultimately that ego was a mistake, a myth, that it just isn't part of what's real, and of entering the real world, which is right here now all the time, without that sense of I. And this is what we're going to be describing and discussing more and more as we enter the Mahayana path, which is all about the practitioner entering the real world the world of Shunyata. The first bhumi is the entrance into the Mahayana path. What he described, here is the path of seeing. That is the entrance into the Mahayana. And then the fourth path, the path of meditation, is the progress through the Mahayana, because even though the practitioner has really discovered the real and egolessness, and that is the Mahayana, nonetheless, this little subtle tendency to self-aggrandizement continues. It just hangs on. This thing of, how am I doing? I'm on the path. Well, am I on the first bhumi? Am I on the second bhumi? No one ever really knows what bhumi they're on. But, there's this feeling of, am I progressing along the path? It just gets subtler and subtler and subtler all the way to the end of that path. Even though the practitioner is really understanding a lot about what reality means. Shunyata. True wisdom, prajna. True compassion, open-heartedness, And yet, there's this constant hanging on of watching oneself and judging and evaluating. And that's what's wearing out all the way up to the end of the Mahayana path, which is enlightenment itself, and the entrance into the Vajrayana, which is no longer a path towards enlightenment, because enlightenment is there, but it is a growing appreciation of the beauty and vividness and meaning of this world as it presents itself in the present moment. So I hope that's helpful. We have two participants who've raised their hands. Is Barry still here?
No, he left. Mohan has a question.
Mohan, okay.
Hey, so I just wanted to mention a favorite quote of mine related to the previous question. It's from Khalil Gibran. He said that a man may commit suicide in self-defense.
In self-defense. That's good. Thank you. That was Khalil Gibran.
And I have a question, Jan. Okay, so it's just a clarification I need.
What?
So it looks like, sorry, is there any issue with my voice? Audio here?
Yeah, okay. I'm working. I'm listening on it.
Okay. So all these 5 steps, I believe, are they all sequential? Because I see at least there is some overlap between the second and third steps, right? So
yeah, there's overlap, and we go back and forth. They are sequential on the whole, but definitely you never really know where you are, except the third path. The third path is very distinct, and when a person begins to experience what is described in the third path, I don't think there's much question. And that's what allows them to actually practice meditation, not as a mental exercise, but as a return to reality, a constant remembering. And that's the fourth path. Yeah, that's very profound.
okay,
Thank
thanks,
you.
John.
Valerie, you said there was someone else?
Samb.
Hi. So I guess the first question is it correct to say that it's not to end suffering, but rather to make it so that it doesn't control you, so that you're sort of aware completely of the suffering and that it doesn't need to affect the ego, rather than like ending suffering?
Michael, would you like to address?
I'll start with that. I think that the idea is that through the experience of suffering, we begin to develop insight into how our mind works, and we begin to develop some insight into, for instance, how we take things to be real that aren't. I think at one point in one of the readings we did in the last week or two, Trungpa Rinpoche talked about beginning to see thoughts as transparent, for instance, where we begin to realize we don't have to believe everything we think, so that it's what happens is, we change. I guess you could say we change our relationship to suffering. But the important thing is developing insight into how our minds work, how how we take things to be real that aren't, how we identify with things that aren't real. Most fundamentally, the belief in a self or belief in an ego, and that suffering, as I said in the beginning, it serves as kind of a wake-up call that the way that we ordinarily live our lives, we're living in a dream, and that in fact we can wake up, so that the experience of suffering becomes very different.
Mhm.
But we still experience old age and death and so on, but our experience of them is very different, as I understand.
Right.
And I'd also like to add, there are basically two versions of suffering. We're not getting rid of the pain of being stabbed in the leg, for instance, or breaking your leg, falling down and breaking your leg. These pains, these kinds of suffering, having a disease, or having someone die, even. That's one kind of suffering, and enlightened people still experience that. The suffering of birth, old age, sickness, death. But what the Buddhist path is dealing with is psychological suffering, the wish that things were otherwise, which torments us constantly, and the attempt to constantly change things according to an idea. And really, it's about that fundamental psychological suffering. That's what the path is dealing with. The wish that things were different, the desire to improve one's circumstances and one's being, to improve self-improvement. That's very painful and unhappy making.
May I add a point related to that?
Yes?
I was actually watching a documentary on Netflix, and it was showing how in the brain activity of monks who have done high amounts of meditation, many hours, they the psychological aspect to the pain is like they don't experience anticipation of it, but then when the pain comes, it's higher activity, but it goes down much quicker, the activity in the brain, so its baseline state. So I found that very interesting.
Yeah. And once someone asked Trungpa Rinpoche, if the Buddha got a cold, would he actually suffer? The way we do when we have a cold. And what Rinpoche said is the Buddha would suffer much more because his mind is so clear, that he's not trying to get rid of it. Whereas we are so distracted, by one thing and the next, that we hardly, we relatively, we don't even notice it as much.
Right. That's cool.
Thank you.
There's a sutra in which the Buddha talks about the experience of someone actually being shot with an arrow, and how someone who is not a practitioner suffers a great deal, not just because of being punctured by the arrow, but all of the anxiety and all of the self-doubt and all of the obsession over over what's happened. Whereas someone who is a practitioner would obviously feel the pain of the arrow, but wouldn't have all the secondary or elaborated suffering. Actually, the way he put it is the person who practices only gets shot once, and the person who does not practice gets shot many times. But only the first shot is a real one. All the rest are in the mind.
Thank you, Megan. That's great.
The Buddha said it better than I did, but that was the idea.
Valerie, you have your hand raised.
Just a quick comment. In talking about death and the issue of suicide and the real world, that I have a little trouble reconciling that with the concept of eternity, no eternity. So the body falls away, thoughts, lots of things fall away. But if there's a consciousness that continues, isn't that a form of eternity, eternalism? I'm struggling with that. And Jane has a question too. And I know it's starting to get late.
It is
Thank you.
indeed. I think what we're going to do is I'll address that issue. And then
Big.
we have, we'll go a little further, and then we have a discussion group tomorrow night after meditation, when people can bring this to the discussion group. I hope you come. It's been really good in the past, these discussion groups. Consciousness, there are different words for consciousness, and the consciousness that forms a self is one kind of consciousness. And then the consciousness which is associated with the real is really just another word for reality. And it's not something that you can point to. It's not something that has existence with a beginning and an end and a boundary. It's really saying that this reality is really fundamentally indescribable. And it's not, they wouldn't say it's eternal, because you can't find it. And yet it is the foundation of all that is. Now, within that, the consciousness of I is a constant coming and going, a constant occurrence. Just like this word, I, it has a beginning and an end. And as long as the whole problem of ignorance and of confusion is that I has been maintaining itself, trying to maintain itself over and over again. It can't really, because you say the word I, and there it starts and it's over. It has to be repeated. And so what I does is it comes up with different stratagems for keeping itself, the story of I, going. And it's constant back and forth between I and other. That is regarded as being utterly impermanent, although we think that I is permanent in some way. We can't imagine being without it. I think I'm going to stop there. Michael, do you have anything to add?
No, it's a question that actually anticipates the Mahayana and Vajrayana. But if you think of just looking for the fundamental nature of mind, it actually says in the morning chant that we do, nothing whatever, but everything arises from it.
Yeah, it's nothing whatever.
In itself.
Yeah, because nothing has any true substance. Everything is a constant appearing and disappearing. As this gesture, and as these words appear, they're already disappearing. So you can't find them. You can't find them to hold on to them. And it's the same with everything. All the six knowables are constantly dying as they arise. They have no substance. So nothing whatever, meaning those six knowables, but everything, meaning the appearances, these constant appearances, arise. There's a slogan in the Vajrayana, they say, things arise, and yet they don't exist. They don't exist, and yet they appear. They arise. And that is a description of what we're sitting in the middle of. All of this. Magical. They call it a magical display. And we are part of it. So I know that we're late. It's now 7. And I think we're going to stop. Is that okay, Michael?
Yeah.
And we will resume this discussion, I hope, tomorrow after meditation. We'll have the group discussion. So please come and contribute your questions and observances and comments and all of that. Okay, can we close with the dedication of merit? This is dedicating the merit that is earned by our efforts tonight to the benefit of all sentient beings, which is a very Mahayana aspiration. So we're anticipating the Mahayana in reality here. So I'm going to mute everybody. Well, actually, no, yeah, we'll mute everybody. I think tonight we got too many people to do cacophony. So come tomorrow, we'll have cacophony. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigden's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled. May all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, John.
Thank you,
Michael.
everyone.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Wonderful to see you all.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you, Sam.
Bye.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Michael.
Yes.
Thanks, John. Thank you, Michael.
Hey, Fred.
Thanks. Thank you, Michael. Thanks, John. Thanks,
Good night,
everyone.
everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
That was wonderful.